In the dead heat of the Nevada desert, there's a wind that doesn't howl, it whispers. Locals say if you stand still long enough, you'll hear it calling out children's names. Names no one alive remembers. And every time those whispers rise, people think back to the one family they never dared to confront, the Corpsewoods. They arrived in 1867, dragging with them a wagon covered in tarp and tied shut with more chains than luggage, as if something inside was fighting to get out. From the moment they moved in, desert animals began avoiding their land. Birds circled above but never landed. Coyotes barked through the nights but never crossed their fence line. Something was wrong there long before anyone found proof. The first child died within weeks. A tiny coffin, too small and too quiet, was lowered into the sand. But mourners said the parents didn't shed a tear. Instead, they waited until everyone left, then returned to the grave with lanterns and tools. By dawn, the dirt was unnaturally smooth, as if the burial had never happened at all. For 3 nights afterward, travelers swore they saw a small figure digging near the Corpsewood ranch pale, barefoot and moving with a jerky, broken rhythm. And then, one morning, a child who looked exactly like the dead one was seen playing outside their house, but its eyes were wrong, not glowing, not dead, just empty, like it hadn't learned how to be human yet. People tried to ignore it, tried to pretend the desert wasn't giving birth to something that used to be a child. But by the time the second and third burials happened, the truth became impossible to outrun. The Corpsewoods weren't losing children. They were growing new ones, from whatever they buried beneath the sand. In 1867, when the Corpsewood family packed their wagons and left Pennsylvania, no one understood why they chose the harsh emptiness of Nevada as their new home. The official story was simple. The father wanted open land, the mother wanted quiet, and the children were too young to have opinions. But behind closed doors, neighbors whispered about things that didn't line up. The family had moved 3 times in the previous decade, each time shortly after the mysterious death of one of their children. Rumors followed them like shadows, claims of odd rituals, strange lights inside their barn at night, and the lingering smell of chemicals drifting from their cellar even in the dead of winter. No one ever confronted them directly, because every town they passed through seemed relieved the moment they left, as though their absence lifted some unseen tension from the streets. By the time they reached the desert, the Corpsewoods spoke almost nothing of their past. They claimed they needed a place untouched by gossip, a place where they could start fresh and work the land in peace. But settlers traveling the same trail noticed odd behaviors. The father marking the ground every few miles with little bundles wrapped in cloth, the mother muttering to herself while burying small jars near dry creek beds, the children silent and distant, walking as if guided by some instruction no one else could hear. They carried very little furniture and almost no personal belongings, yet one long wooden crate took 6 men to lift and was guarded closely throughout the journey. Whenever someone asked about it, the father's eyes went cold and his hand drifted to the hunting knife on his belt until the conversation naturally ended. When they finally reached a forgotten stretch of Nevada territory, surrounded by jagged rocks and sunburnt fields, they stopped without hesitation, like they had been following some invisible map only they could see. The land was barren, cracked, and hostile to life, but something about it seemed to comfort them. They built their house faster than any family should with the tools they had, and they dug the foundation deeper than necessary, as though they intended to house more than just themselves beneath the earth. People who helped during construction reported hearing knocks from inside the crate even before it was opened, though the Corpsewoods insisted it was only the desert heat warping the wood. Within days of settling, they fenced off a circular portion of land far from the house, forbidding anyone to go near it. At night, lanterns glowed from that area, flickering in unnatural rhythms that didn't match candlelight or wind. Travelers riding past said the flicker resembled breathing, slow and deliberate. The family ignored the few curious souls who questioned their behavior, always responding with the same unsettling calmness, as if nothing about their actions needed explanation. Yet despite their quiet exterior, every movement they made suggested purpose, urgency, and a secrecy so heavy it seemed to stain the desert around them. marking their arrival as the beginning of something the land itself had been waiting for, something that would take root the moment the first grave was dug. The first burial came sooner than anyone expected, and it happened so quietly that most settlers didn't even learn the child had died until they saw the small procession moving across the sand. The Corpsewoods walked in a straight, disciplined line behind the tiny wooden box, their faces dry, their steps measured, their silence so absolute it felt rehearsed. There were no prayers, no sobs, no trembling hands. Even the desert wind, usually sharp and restless, seemed to pause as the coffin was lowered into the ground. It wasn't just grief that was missing that day. It was humanity. The parents acted not like they were losing a child, but like they were following instructions they had practiced many times before. People watching from a distance whispered that the mother kept glancing at the sun, timing each step as if the burial needed to be completed before a specific moment. When the dirt was finally thrown over the small grave, the family stood motionless for several seconds, staring at the mound with an intensity that made onlookers uncomfortable, as though they were waiting for something to happen. But what happened next disturbed the witnesses far more. When the crowd thinned and the sun dipped low, the Corpsewoods returned to the burial site with lanterns, shovels, and a long roll of linen. Their steps were quick now, focused, almost frantic. They dug back into the fresh grave with a rhythm that didn't match mourning or panic. It matched precision. People who camped nearby later claimed they heard muffled chopping sounds, the soft thud of earth being shifted again, and hushed voices speaking in tones that carried no emotion. Those who were close enough to see faint silhouettes said the parents moved as though performing a ritual rather than handling the body of their child. One rumor said the mother separated something from the corpse and wrapped it carefully in the linen, cradling it the way someone might carry a newborn instead of a piece of the dead. By dawn, the grave looked untouched. The sand was smooth, undisturbed, almost perfectly flat. There were no footprints, no shovel marks, nothing to indicate anyone had been there at all. It was as if the burial itself had been a staged performance meant for the public, while the real work took place in the secrecy of night. When morning travelers passed by the Corpsewood ranch, they noticed the father carrying a bundle toward the fenced-off circle of land behind their house, the area no one was allowed to enter. He walked slowly, deliberately, holding it against his chest, the same way he once carried his living children. The mother followed close behind, her eyes fixed straight ahead, her expression calm in a way that made people uneasy. Over the following days, those who lived nearby began to notice changes in the land. The sand near the grave seemed darker, as though soaked by something other than water. Small indentations, too tiny to be adult footprints yet too defined to be caused by animals, appeared in the morning and vanished by afternoon. And every night faint scratching sounds drifted from beneath the ground, not loud enough to prove anything, but just clear enough to make people realize the Corpsewood family hadn't buried their child to say goodbye. They had buried something they intended to use. It was 3 days after the burial when someone first reported seeing the pale toddler wandering near the Corpsewood property, and at first everyone dismissed it as a misunderstanding. Grief could twist memories, shadows could play tricks in the desert heat, and travelers often mistook distant shapes for living things. But the second sighting came from a ranch hand with no connection to the family, a man who had no reason to invent stories. He claimed he saw a small child crouched in the sand at dawn, its back turned, its fingers digging furiously into the dirt as though searching for something buried beneath the surface. When he called out, the child froze but didn't look up. Instead, it rose in an unnaturally stiff motion, limbs straightening too slowly, head tilting in a way that didn't resemble human curiosity. Only when it turned did the ranch hand notice the face-soft, round, familiar. It looked exactly like the Corpsewood child who had been buried days earlier, down to the tiny crescent-shaped scar under the left eye. But something essential was missing, the spark, the confusion, the innocence. The expression was blank, as if the child hadn't quite learned how to mimic emotion yet. Word spread quickly, whispered from tent to cabin, until even those who avoided gossip found themselves glancing toward the Corpsewood ranch every time they crossed that stretch of desert. By the time the third witness, a passing trader, claimed he saw the same child standing barefoot by the fence, staring at his wagon wheels as if studying their shape. The story had grown too persistent to ignore. People noticed strange things about the sightings. The child was always alone, always silent, and always seen in the early hours of morning before the heat rose. There were no footprints leading to it or away from it, just the marks it made while standing still, toes pressing into the sand like roots pushing downward rather than feet moving forward. What disturbed people the most wasn't the sightings themselves, but the behavior of the Corpsewood family when confronted. A group of settlers approached the ranch one afternoon to offer condolences again, secretly hoping the family would confirm or deny the rumors. The father answered the door with a calmness that felt rehearsed, insisting their child was resting peacefully and that grief had made people imagine things. But as he spoke, a faint scratching noise echoed from beneath the floorboards inside the house, rhythmic and steady. The mother quickly stepped forward, blocking the doorway, her smile tight, her eyes refusing to blink. She urged the settlers to leave, saying the desert played tricks on tired minds. But her voice trembled in a way that didn't sound like sorrow, it sounded like fear of being discovered. In the evenings, more unsettling details began to surface. Coyotes, usually bold scavengers, avoided the Corpsewood property entirely, circling the perimeter and whining softly before retreating into the night. Birds that flew overhead dipped in altitude as if pushed by a downward force, then hastily regained their flight path, never once landing near the ranch. Travelers who passed by claimed they heard soft giggles carried by the wind, the kind only small children could make, but the laughter always stopped abruptly, as if someone had snapped their fingers to silence it. The most chilling moment came when an elderly woman from a nearby settlement insisted she saw the toddler up close. She said the child was watching her as she walked past the fence line, its body still, its head tilted. When she waved timidly, hoping to coax a response, the child lifted its hand too, but the movement was delayed a fraction too slow, like it wasn't responding to her gesture but trying to mimic what it thought a child should do. She noticed the fingers were oddly stiff, the skin around the knuckles slightly darker, almost stitched looking. And when a gust of wind blew sand into its face, the child didn't blink. By the end of the week, one truth settled across the settlement like dust. The child people were seeing wasn't alive in the way a child should be. Whatever had come out of that grave, it looked like the Corpsewoods' lost child, but no one could mistake it for something born of life. It was something that had been remade. Something regrown from whatever parts the family had chosen to bury. As the weeks passed, the strange appearances of the pale toddler no longer felt like isolated incidents. Instead, a pattern began to emerge, one that twisted the settlement's unease into something closer to terror. When the second Corpsewood child died, people expected mourning, prayers, or at least the familiar hush of grief settling over a household. But once again, the burial felt mechanical, emotionless, and timed with unsettling precision. The family held the funeral just before dusk, and though the coffin was sealed, several witnesses claimed they saw the father adjusting something inside it, not with tenderness but with deliberate calculation. The mother stood nearby, gripping a small linen pouch tightly in her hands, her knuckles pale, her stare fixed on nothing. Children watching from a distance whispered that the parents weren't burying their child, they were planting something. 3 nights later, a young shepherd boy spotted 2 figures near the edge of the Corpsewood land. Both were small, about the height of toddlers, both moving with the same strange stiffness as the first child. At first he thought the family's surviving children were playing outside after dark, but when one of the figures turned toward him, he recognized the same blank, empty expression he'd heard described in whispers around the settlement. Only this time there were 2. The second child's face was eerily similar to its deceased sibling, but the proportions seemed slightly off, like features sculpted from memory instead of flesh. One eye sat a little lower, the jawline seemed too straight, and the smile it attempted looked more like a grimace, as if its muscles didn't know how to arrange themselves correctly. The shepherd boy ran home sobbing, insisting he had seen 2 of the same child, walking in perfect synchronization, their feet barely lifting from the ground. By morning, half the settlement had heard the story, and the details grew more disturbing with each retelling. People began counting the living Corpsewood children, comparing numbers with how many were seen lingering in the desert shadows. And troublingly, those numbers never matched. Some nights, witnesses claimed they saw three pale figures moving behind the fence line, even though only one Corpsewood child remained alive. Other nights, the figures seemed to retreat into the sand itself, disappearing with unnatural speed when approached. Patterns in the land reflected a deeper truth. Shallow indentations shaped like small bodies appeared overnight and smoothed out by afternoon. Not by wind, but by something moving beneath the surface. The circular plot of land the Corpsewoods had fenced off began to show signs of strange, growth-thin trails that looked like roots but pulsed faintly under the lantern light, as though something inside the earth was alive and hungry. A miner who passed by after sunset reported seeing tiny handprints pressed deep into the dirt, each one spaced evenly apart as if a line of children had marched there silently, leaving their marks in unison. The settlement started to realize that the Corpsewood family wasn't simply losing their children. They were replacing them. Every death was followed by a resurrection of something similar but not entirely right, something that carried the shape of a child but lacked its soul. And each new child seemed more refined than the last, as if the parents were learning, adjusting, improving whatever process they used to grow them from the remains buried in the desert. It was no longer a question of whether the Corpsewoods were involved in something unnatural. The real question became how many children they had buried, how many they had remade, and how many more were hidden beneath the sand, waiting for the right moment to rise. Sheriff Halbrook first heard the complaints in fragment soft warnings from ranchers, uneasy observations from travelers, and one trembling account from a shepherd boy who insisted the Corpsewood children weren't real children anymore. At first, the sheriff dismissed it as frontier superstition, the kind that spread easily in empty places where night came fast and silence lingered too long. But the stories kept piling up, all of them circling the same impossible details. Pale toddlers seen before dawn, identical faces appearing in different parts of the desert at the same time, strange marks appearing in the sand that no animal could have made. Eventually, even a hard-headed lawman like Halbrook couldn't ignore what people were so afraid to say directly, that the Corpsewood ranch was hiding something unnatural. Determined to put an end to the rumors, he rode out to the property one afternoon, the sun high and scorching, the air dry enough to sting the lungs. As he approached the fence, he noticed something odd. The ground around the ranch looked freshly disturbed, but not from farming or construction. It looked padded, smoothed down, as though someone wanted to erase every trace of movement. Near the fence posts, tiny impressions dotted the ground, arranged with unsettling symmetry. They resembled footprints, but they were too small, too narrow, and too deep, as if whatever made them pressed into the earth with unnatural weight. When Halbrook crouched to examine them, he felt a chill crawl up his spine despite the heat. The prints weren't random. They formed a spiral, a perfect inward-turning circle leading toward the fenced-off area behind the house. Before knocking on the door, he circled the property, looking for signs of neglect, abuse, or anything that might explain the growing panic among settlers. Instead, he found more evidence that raised questions he couldn't voice. Along the side of the house, the sand had been etched with dozens of parallel lines, each one thin and straight, like marks left by fingers dragging through the dirt in perfect harmony. There were no signs of wind, no animal tracks, no footprints from the family themselves, just lines. Lines that curved slightly toward the back of the property where the forbidden patch of land sat, fenced off and humming with a stillness that felt alive. When Halbrook finally reached the door, he noticed the windows were covered from the inside with thick fabric, blocking out all sunlight. The house was too quiet, too still. Before he could knock, the mother appeared, her expression polite but strained. She greeted him with an unsettling calm, insisting everything was fine, the family was grieving, and the rumors were nothing more than cruel talk from bored settlers. But as she spoke, Halbrook heard it, a faint sound beneath the floor, soft and rhythmic, like fingernails lightly tapping wood. The mother's smile didn't waver, but her eyes flicked toward the source of the noise. Betraying a moment of panic, she quickly hid. This was enough to confirm Halbrook's unease, though not yet enough to justify forcing his way inside. He stepped away from the door, promising to return, but something pulled him toward the fenced-off circle behind the house. As he walked toward it, He felt the ground shift ever so slightly under his boots, like something beneath the surface was moving in slow, coordinated patterns. When he reached the fence, he froze. Pressed deep into the sand, arranged in pairs facing the house, were dozens of tiny handprints. They were too perfectly spaced, too uniform, as though a crowd of children had stood there in utter silence, waiting for something or someone to call them forward. The prints were fresh. The sun hadn't yet dried their edges. Sheriff Halbrook rode away from the ranch that day with a weight in his chest he couldn't explain. He had gone there expecting to find neglect or madness. Instead, he found evidence that the children around the Corpsewood land weren't wandering by chance. They were gathering, they were learning. They were responding to something only they could hear. The night the screaming began, the settlement realized the Corpsewood situation had grown far beyond strange sightings and whispered concerns. It started just after midnight when the desert was at its coldest and the wind had died into complete stillness. People were jolted awake by a single, sharp wail, high-pitched, childlike, and echoing across the open land with a force that felt impossible. Doors swung open, lamps were lit, and neighbors stepped outside thinking a child had wandered too far or been attacked by coyotes, but within seconds that one scream multiplied. Another voice chimed in, then another, then three more, rising in volume and intensity until the entire desert seemed alive with the sound of children crying out at once. The unsettling part wasn't the volume, it was the harmony. Each scream matched the others in pitch and timing as though rehearsed. It didn't sound like panic. It sounded like a chorus. Settlers rushed toward the direction of the noise, but the moment they stepped beyond their own land, the desert swallowed their footsteps and magnified the sounds ahead. The screams weren't random, they pulsed in intervals, building and collapsing in a rhythm too precise to be natural. Some people described it like waves. Others said it resembled a chant without words. A few swore it sounded like the cries were circling the Corpsewood ranch, moving in predictable loops around the property. One man, who had been closer to the ranch than anyone else, insisted the voices weren't moving around the house, they were moving beneath it. As people gathered in small groups, fear pushing them closer, the screams suddenly shifted. Instead of one unified chorus, the voices splintered into separate pitches, as if the children, if they were children at all, were calling to each other in a language of their own creation. The pattern was eerie, a sort of call and response that carried across the desert like a message. It was then that several listeners noticed something even more disturbing. None of the screams carried the raw edge of pain. They were too smooth, too controlled, almost strained, as if the voices came from mouths that didn't understand what emotion should sound like, but tried to imitate it anyway. The Corpsewood house remained dark throughout the ordeal. No lanterns flickered inside, no silhouettes moved across the windows. It stood like a silent structure at the center of an unnatural storm. People argued whether to approach it, but before anyone could decide, the screaming changed again. This time it rose rapidly, climbing higher and higher until the sound felt like it might split the air. And then all at once it stopped. Not faded, not trailed off, stopped. The silence that followed was so sudden and complete that even the animals of the desert remained quiet, as if nature itself was stunned into stillness. A few brave settlers who stepped forward described a final sound they heard just after the screaming ended, a soft rustling under the sand, like dozens of small hands dragging through loose soil. Some claimed they saw faint shapes retreating toward the Corpsewood property, moving in synchronized patterns, their outlines barely visible in the moonlight. It was enough to send everyone back to their homes, locking doors that had never needed locking before, praying that the silence meant the nightmare was over. But deep down, no one believed it. The screams had been too coordinated, too calculated, as if whatever roamed the desert that night had been practicing, testing its voices, testing how far they could travel, testing how the living would react. And the worst part wasn't the noise itself. It was the realization that the children who died in the Corpsewood family weren't resting in their graves. They were gathering strength. They were learning to communicate. And they were no longer hiding in the shadows. They were announcing themselves to the desert, preparing for whatever step came next. By the time the settlement recovered from the night of unified screaming, sleep became a luxury most people couldn't afford. But exhaustion wasn't the worst part. It was the discovery that something new had begun happening around the Corpsewood ranch. Something quieter than screams, yet far more terrifying in its intent. People started waking to the sound of soft tapping on their windows just before dawn, the same hour the pale toddlers were often spotted. At first the taps were faint, almost hesitant, like the knock of a bird or the shifting of a tree branch. But Nevada had no trees tall enough to reach windows, and the taps always came in perfect, rhythmic pairs. Some settlers described them as fingers. Others described them as nails. One widow insisted she heard the pattern spelling something, like a code patiently waiting to be understood. When settlers finally gathered enough courage to peer outside during these disturbances, they never saw a figure standing directly at the glass. Instead, they caught glimpses of small shapes slipping out of view, moving with unnatural smoothness along the edges of houses or vanishing behind water barrels without leaving footprints. The sand around each home remained smooth, undisturbed, except for the occasional perfectly circular imprint, a small hand pressed flat against the ground, fingers spread as though marking territory. These prints always faced toward the settlement, never away, like they were placed deliberately for people to find in the morning. Animals suffered the earliest consequences. Chickens refused to leave their coops. Horses trembled violently at night, their eyes wide, staring into corners as if watching something climb the shadows. One rancher found his dog whimpering beside the barn door, staring at the dirt where 6 tiny handprints formed a semicircle around its water bowl, evenly spaced and pressed with unnatural depth. Within days, nearly every pet in the settlement refused to go outside after sunset, reacting to something their owners couldn't see but could feel lingering in the spaces between buildings. It became clear something had changed in the behaviors of the Corpsewood creations. They were no longer simply wandering or observing. They were studying, watching, testing boundaries the same way children test the rules of a new game. Settlers began reporting strange noises outside their walls while they tried to wrest off scraping sounds moving from one end of the house to the other, pausing beneath windows, then continuing along in slow, deliberate passes. These movements were too coordinated to belong to coyotes, too soft to belong to grown humans. And the unsettling part wasn't just the noise. It was the pacing, the way the sounds moved with identical timing each night, as if several figures were circling homes with rehearsed precision. The Corpsewood family remained silent through all of this. Their windows stayed covered. Their smoke never rose from the chimney. Those who dared approach the ranch spoke of a strange, humming vibration in the ground that made their bones feel heavy. The land itself seemed to pulse in weak, steady beats, as though something beneath the soil was breathing. What terrified the settlement most was when the patterns became unmistakably intelligent. One night, a farmer found 3 small stones placed outside his door, arranged in a perfect triangle pointing toward his house. Another found a circle of handprints around her well, each print angled inward, as if the children had been gathered around it in silent anticipation. And one morning, the widow who lived closest to the Corpsewood ranch found a small, pale footprint on her porch step. Only one, not leading toward the door or away from it. Just one, placed precisely in the center, as though left intentionally a message, a signature, a warning. People realized the Corpsewood children weren't just wandering anymore. They were mapping the settlement, memorizing the shapes of houses, the routines of neighbors, the weak spots in fences and doors. They were learning the layout of the living like hunters preparing for a hunt. The disappearance of Sheriff Halbrook marked the moment the settlement understood the Corpsewood situation had crossed a line that could no longer be denied or contained. He had set out before dawn, determined to confront the family once and for all, armed not just with his rifle, but with the grim conviction that whatever lived beneath that ranch had grown too bold. By mid-morning, his horse wandered back alone, reins dragging in the sand, the saddle torn by what looked like dozens of tiny grasping fingers. The sight of it sent a silent wave of dread crawling through the settlement. No one dared to go after him, not after the sounds they had been hearing at night, not after the strange markings appearing outside their homes, not after realizing the Corpsewood creations had begun studying them with patient, chilling precision. As the sun climbed, the strange quiet around the ranch deepened. The air felt thick, heavy, as though the desert itself was holding its breath. Several men gathered the courage to approach the property's edge, but none crossed the fence. Beyond the wooden posts, the ground looked wrong. Smooth, unnaturally packed, like something had been crawling just beneath the surface and had pressed upward before sinking back down. Small, shallow mounds stretched across the dirt, each about the size of a child's body, arranged in rows that extended far farther than the eye could follow. It became clear that the Corpsewoods hadn't buried just their children there. They had been planting something, growing something, cultivating it with ritualistic care, and the land now bulged with the shapes of whatever waited below. Suddenly, a faint rustling broke the silence, a soft shifting sound like sand sliding over skin. It moved in waves, starting near the house and spreading outward. The men listened, frozen, as tiny hands began pressing up through the soil one by one, leaving perfect imprints that formed straight, evenly spaced lines. Nothing emerged fully, but the message was undeniable. Whatever was under the ground was awake, aware, and responding to the presence of the living. Then the Corpsewood door creaked open, and the mother stepped outside. Her expression was calm, too calm, her eyes glassy, as though she hadn't slept in years. She didn't shout or threaten. She simply whispered something toward the ground, a sound too soft for the men to hear, but one that traveled like a current through the soil. The mounds shifted in unison, the imprints deepened, and the rustling grew louder, more eager, more synchronized. The men stumbled back, terror gripping them as they realized something far worse than resurrection was happening here. The Corpsewoods weren't replacing their dead children anymore, they were multiplying them, perfecting them, preparing them. And the things beneath that ranch were no longer just infants learning to mimic life. They were a growing legion, bound not by blood but by creation, waiting for one signal to rise fully from the earth. That signal came at dusk, when the last bit of sunlight faded and the desert turned cold. Dozens of pale faces broke the surface, identical and expressionless, their blank eyes fixed on the settlement with chilling intent, and as the first one pulled itself free of the soil, its lips stretched into a smile that was too wide, too knowing, and meant for everyone watching. So if you want to hear the rest of this nightmare, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe.